I do see a few new faces tonight, so I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. I'm Tom Hundley. I'm the senior editor here at the Pulitzer Center, and we are a journalism nonprofit organization that gives grants to journalists to cover significant but often ignored or underreported stories outside the United States. And there's tremendous diversity in this enterprise. If you go to our website, you'll find a very interesting sample of the kind of work that we do. And just this past week, you find a fascinating daily blog on the World Cup from Matthew Niederhauser that's being published in the New Republic for Spain. Matthew is a true lover of the game, but he's not doing game stories. Instead, he's looking at how governments use the spectacle of the great event to cover up a great variety of social ills. You'd also see a very disturbing story that ran in Time magazine by Jason Modlog about the Burmese government and its appalling treatment of its Muslim minority. And a multi-part series in Global Post by Carol Murphy about the growing tension between Saudi Arabia's official ultra-conservative religious establishment and the young generation that's been exposed to the rest of the world through digital technology, and the threat that this poses to the Saudi monarchy. Another important part of our mission is educational outreach. We take this journalism into schools and into a network of nearly 24 universities that we call our campus consortium. And earlier today, this room was filled with students from the Cesar Chavez Charter School here at DC. This evening's program is part of that outreach. Mellissa Fung is a former correspondent for CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She's done 2 reporting projects for us, one on Canadian mining interests in developing countries, and it was shown on the CBC's flagship evening broadcast, The National, and in this country on the PBS NewsHour. Her most recent project with us, and that will be the subject of her talk this evening. It's on girls' education in Afghanistan. Mellissa was a CBC correspondent in Afghanistan, and she's also the author of the book Under an Afghan Sky, which describes her harrowing experience as a hostage in Afghanistan. Melissa's going to show us a short video this evening, and then speak for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Melissa?
Decided we don't need the mic, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. I am going to start with a cut-down version of the documentary that I made when I went back to Afghanistan last year. I want to concentrate on some of the good things that were happening in that country, and education is a bright spot. So I will start with that, and then that'll give us a basis for a conversation. I can. Command F, right?
Command F, yeah.
Okay.
And this one is so precious. That's so mad. He would always sleep with his hand on his head like that. And Luke is
doing it too.
Brenda lives in Kingston, Ontario. All 4 of her sons served in Afghanistan. Matthew was the youngest.
Congratulations. That was his graduation.
Force, Afghanistan!
I don't know who killed Matt, and I don't really. It doesn't matter to me. But I know what killed him, though. It's hatred and intolerance and ignorance. So what are you going to do about it? Of course, the military is gone and everything, but the need is still there. Education is the only way, really.
To maintain support.
I think it is. I think it will be.
Da felt a need to finish her son's mission, so she started volunteering with a small group of women in Kingston after Matt died. Their mission, to make a difference for women and children in Afghanistan.
The potential is with the young people, the children and the women.
We're so excited that we're actually going to meet the children at our school.
Madeline Tarasic and her best friend Margaret Stewart, both educators, founded the Kingston chapter of Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, an NGO with chapters across the country. This May, the two women finally decided that it was time to go see for themselves what their decade of fundraising had accomplished. I invited myself to go with them. I saw in their journey an opportunity to finish what I'd started. The House of Flowers Orphanage in the heart of Kabul is more than just home to 30 children. It's where they live, learn, and play, their refuge from the war. All made possible by the generosity of several non-governmental organizations, including Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan.
Care bearers.
These are the most vulnerable of children. Many have seen a lifetime of trauma in their few short years. Some saw their parents gunned down right before their eyes. Others were simply abandoned. Faruza is 12 years old. Both of her parents died when she was 8. I remember when they died, she says, a motor bicycle accident. She likes math and English and wants to be a doctor when she grows up.
And I see everyone, and I see everyone.
I'm madly in love with the place. I got the bug.
Lauren Oates understands. She's the young Canadian who oversees all of Women for Women's projects in Afghanistan.
We're this close to lifting this country out of the rut that it's been in, the thunderstorm that it's been in for 3 decades, to make change irreversible. We're so close, and we just need a little bit more time.
Does anyone want to tell what their plan is, what their dream is? A doctor. Okay. Come on. This is new.
Murawat Ziai is Women for Women's Afghan Country Director, intimately involved in all of the projects the NGO sponsors.
We are thirsty for education. We are mad for employment, to be independent, to be on our own. These are the things that we desire for as a nation, and this can't be possible without like a strong government.
The day after we visited the school, a suicide bomb exploded nearby, killing 12 and injuring dozens more. One of the biggest challenges for Lauren Oates.
Yeah, it makes the work harder, and it makes it harder for Canadians to buy into when they're seeing the news back home about all the violence. It's a huge struggle to try to keep the other side of things alive in the minds of Canadians, to keep bringing back that message that there's change happening here. It's so important. We're so close. This is our last chance. There were promises made to the Afghans. The international community, including Canada, said, we will be there with you. We'll be there until there's peace. We will stand by you to rebuild your country, to rebuild the education sector. We care about the education of girls. We care about what happened to women under the Taliban. So those promises were made. Afghans heard them. And Afghans can also smell betrayal a long way off because they've been betrayed before.
You don't heal, you get used to the idea. You get a big scar. You feel a bit like an amputee. You know, you get used to live with it, but your arm is always gone. You know, so that's what it is with Matt.
For Renda and her husband Peter, the work the NGO is doing in Afghanistan helps them stay connected to the son they lost there.
because we have been there, we have to finish. We have to continue. And it doesn't mean troops anymore, fine. But there are other ways. We have to educate women, children particularly, to complete that circle. Otherwise, it is a bit of a waste.
And I just see thousands and thousands of girls that we've helped educate fanning out around the country, and doing anything from becoming a midwife in their community to maybe running for president someday.
We have families, we have children, we have parents, and we care about them. We want them to get education, to work, and have a normal life. A normal life is the right of every human being.
I'm not great at PowerPoint, so you all may have to just bear with me tonight. So that was just a shorter version of the piece that I did out of Afghanistan. And I wanted to tell a more positive story because we hear so much negative news coming out these days. And it is, a lot of it is negative. You had the attack at the Lebanese taverna where I was having dinner a year ago. We had the killing at the Serena Hotel, where for those of us who have spent any time in Afghanistan, every foreigner knows where the Serena is, and we've all eaten there, stayed there, spent time there. So the news has been really bad, and a lot of columnists here in Canada, in Britain, have been saying, we need to just leave because our Afghan saga was perhaps just that, useless, a saga. And Afghans don't want us there. They prefer the Taliban over foreigners. This made me really mad because I know it's only half the story. It's not the full story. Because every Afghan I've talked to says Afghanistan really is better today than it was 12 years ago. That's why I wanted to go back so badly, to show some of the progress that's been made and to show that 2,185 American soldiers, 185 Canadian soldiers didn't die in that Afghan desert for nothing. So I'll just back up here and give you some background. Tom alluded to it when he introduced me. This was my first trip back to Afghanistan in 5 years. Because 5 years ago, I was trying to do a story on the refugee crisis in the country. It was at the height of the war, 2008, 2009. And I was kidnapped while on assignment. I was held by insurgent criminal gang for 28 days in pretty rough conditions. I'm not going to dwell on it, but this is not the venue for that. But ever since I came back, I wanted to go back to Afghanistan to finish the story that I was trying to tell. And that was a positive story. I know I was trying to do a refugee crisis story, but my next stop was going to be an orphanage where kids who were left homeless, parentless by the war were getting an education. That was the story I never got to tell. And I kept looking for opportunities to go back. I kept asking my bosses at the CBC every year, can I go back and cover the election in 2009? Can I go back to take a look at the Canadian training mission in Kabul? The answer was always no. And I didn't really blame them because my kidnapping was really hard on them. They went through a lot. It was the first time it happened to the CBC. They had a journalist in that situation. So they wanted to make sure that it never happened again to any of their journalists, especially they didn't want it to happen to me for a second time. But that was really hard on me for a long time because I got all this attention for something that I never wanted. And I sort of became the reporter who was kidnapped while on assignment. And worst of all, I was held up as an example for people to say, this is why Afghanistan is a hopeless cause. That made me crazy, because as you know, I was trying to do the story of kids getting an education. You know, my friend and my fixer, Shakur, who worked with me there, had always tried to get me to tell stories of women and children while I was there, because we both thought that's a good barometer to gauge the process of his country, the progress of his country. And the male journalist didn't have the access that a female journalist does in that situation. Women and girls are more open to talking to another woman rather than a male. So whenever I went to Afghanistan, Shakur said, "You've got to come to Kabul. There's this great story." You know, so that's what I was doing when I was kidnapped. But of course, we know that I didn't get to tell any of those stories, because from that point on, the only story I could tell was my own, which is never a good thing as a journalist, especially for me. And I admit I got a little depressed. I escaped the worst of post-traumatic stress syndrome, but I had a lot of guilt, because the story people remembered about me was about me. It wasn't a story about, you know, the women and the children, and those were the people who really needed the attention, not me. The story that I really wanted to tell, and this depressed me even more, was getting further out of reach for me. And sorry, I warned you. Okay. Okay. So the story that I really wanted to tell was really getting further and further out of reach for me, and it was about her. This was a little girl I met in Kandahar about 2 weeks before I was kidnapped. It was outside the gate of Camp Nathan Smith, which is the Canadian military's, or the Canadian government's mission in Kandahar. It was where Canadian, both aid workers, you call it USAID here, but we had CEDA, which was a Canadian International Development Agency. It's where they based out of with the military, reaching out to locals in Kandahar. And this was Eid, which celebrates the end of Ramadan. And the Canadians were handing out gifts to selected needy Afghan families, needy Kandahari families, I should say. And they had handed out invitations to these families to come to the mission to receive just simple things like cooking oil, sugar, things like that, the basic necessities, really. But word had spread that this was happening, and you know, those families who were not lucky enough to receive invitations to come came anyway, and they crowded around the gate. I mean, when I got there, this is just a sea of humanity. I couldn't even get near the gate. You know, women were coming up to me in their burqas saying, asking if I could help them get entrance inside, begging for help. They would tell me desperate stories about their husbands being killed or being away fighting in the war, and that they needed help to take care of their kids. All their stories were so desperate. And then in the middle of this mayhem, there was a little tug on my sleeve, and I looked down, and there she was, this little girl, in a pink polka-dotted headscarf. I'd written her name down in my notebook, but then I ended up losing that notebook to my kidnappers, so I don't remember her name. But I luckily took all these pictures of her. See her brown eyes, her little impish smile, and I took a few pictures of her. She wanted to see them. We just hung out. She hung with me the entire time I was out there interviewing people. And through a translator, I found out that she didn't have a father. He had died. Her brother had stepped on a landmine, lost his leg. Her mother was trying to look after them, but she didn't have a job. And I remember turning around to my fixer, Shakur, saying, we should follow her home, wherever her home is, and try to talk to her mother and, her brother, and maybe, if she would be the face of sort of what's going on here. And so Shakur said, okay, we'll set it up. Then suddenly I was being rushed inside the gates of the mission because the military got very nervous that there were journalists outside the gate in a big crowd. And we'd been there for maybe half an hour. They decided it's long enough. So they dragged me away, and I asked them if I could at least bring her in and get her some of the gifts that were being handed out, or get her family some help. And in the confusion, they, pulled her away from me and closed the gate. And I heard her wailing. And I just never felt more helpless in that moment than I haven't since then. Even when I was a hostage, I still didn't feel as helpless as I did that moment. Another reporter who was there with me said, I think he was trying to make me feel better, but it really didn't. Said, you can't save her. In a few years, she's probably going to be in a work and married off to someone. But I never stopped wondering about her. And I even had friends go looking for her. I had a RCMP superintendent friend from Ottawa who was going over for a year to help with the NATO training mission with the AMP, and I gave him all the pictures, saying, just if you get there, can you please look for her. There was another friend, the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, who was going over, and I did the same thing with her. Go look for her. It was my soldier friends who were going back. I gave everybody her picture, but never had any. So I started to try to imagine what her story would look like. And in my mind's eye, I would imagine that she's in school. She might be about 12 right now. And she's doing really well in school, and maybe she has dreams of becoming a teacher or a doctor. I just wanted her story to be a good one. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to find her, so I still looked for ways to go back. And so I latched on to this NGO that you saw in the video, Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan. There are a bunch of retired educators, teachers, school superintendents, who had just, in their volunteer time, spare time, decided they were going to raise money to train teachers in Afghanistan because they really believed that education would sort of end the cycle of violence in that country. So these two women said, well, we're going to maybe go and see what we've been able to do over the last 10 years. These two retirees, right, from Kingston, Ontario. And I said, okay, well, I'm coming with you because I could tell the CBC, if these two retired teachers are going for the first time, it cannot be dangerous for me. I was on a leave at the time, and Pulitzer Center gave me a grant to go. And I was going to write a magazine article about it for the Walrus magazine in Canada. And basically, I bullied the CBC into doing it. But I had to do it their way. So I had to have security, 2 guards, at least 2 armed guards, 2 cars, everywhere I went. The Canadian ambassador had me back to the embassy for dinner, and there were armed men waiting for me outside. It was very restrictive. But I never feared for my safety. We had to stay in Kabul, so I knew finding my little girl in Kandahar would not be an option. But as you saw from the video, what I did find gave me great hope that that story that I imagined for her wasn't really out of touch with reality so much. The Fatima Taldara school, which you saw pictures of, you saw those hands go up when we asked them, what do you want to do when you grow up? They wanted to be teachers, doctors, engineers. There was even one who wanted to be a Holy Quran reader, which is a job that falls to boys in that country. You know, we met Gita and Shazia. There she is, Shazia. And Gita. They are the first girls in their families to go to school, which is pretty amazing. I thought they both had lost their fathers, and their mothers both cleaned other people's clothes for a living. But they were already talking about going to university, like it was a given. They were 9 and 11. Geeta here wants to be a doctor, and Shazia an engineer. Shazia actually wanted to be a doctor first, but when I asked her again 5 minutes later, after Geeta said she wanted to be a doctor, she said, I think then we went to the orphanage, which you saw, and there is Faruza, whose parents were killed and who also wants to be a doctor. Her favorite subject is math. I couldn't believe all the little girls I met. You asked them their favorite subject, always math, you know, which I couldn't understand, and maybe goes to prove that, you know, they were all smarter than I was when I was their age. On my last day in Kabul, I went to visit parliamentarian Fawzia Koofi. Some of you may have heard of her. She's quite an outspoken and slightly controversial opponent for women's rights. I had met her years before, so it was nice to be able to see her again. And I went to her house, we had tea, and we really talked about some of the incredible gains that women have made over the last 12 years. The number of girls in school, for one, and I'll get into more detail about this a bit later, 4 million girls in school, compared to almost none 12 years ago, which is amazing when you consider this is a country that has gone through a decade of war. 30% of the members of the Afghan parliament are women, and Fawzia herself was considering running for president. She missed the age requirement by a year this time, but I'm sure we are going to in the future. But more importantly, I got the chance to talk to her 2 daughters, Shahrazad and Shukra, and they know what having the Taliban come back might mean. They knew that the Taliban had killed their father. He was one of their political prisoners when they were in power in the 90s, and contracted tuberculosis while in prison and died after he was released. They know that Taliban still send their mother night letters, threatening letters saying that if she continues her work in Parliament, they'll kill her and her family. They fear for her life every time she leaves the house. I can't even imagine that here. I can't. But they also tell me their world is very different now. They have cell phones and iPads, and they were downloading apps on my iPhone when they figured out that it was new to me. I couldn't, you know, they were teaching me how to use technology. I asked them what they wanted to do when they grow up, and Shahrazad said, I want to be an aerospace engineer. I said, I don't even know what that means, you know? I said, what's that? Like, I want to maybe be the first Afghan to go to space. Shukra, she said, I just want to be the president, which is pretty amazing. And I know these are all just anecdotes, but they're largely supported by statistics, right? I like to have statistics because they kind of, you know, support the theory. In 2004, Afghanistan signed on to the United Nations Millennium Declaration, which established 9 goals at the Millennium Development Summit in 2000. Some of you probably already know, but I'll just briefly say they are eradicate poverty and hunger, access to universal primary education. I have a slide. That's the one. It's missing. It's okay. I'll just tell you. Promote gender equality, empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, ensure environmental stability, develop a global partnership for development, and they added one more for Afghanistan. The 9th goal was to enhance security. There are indicators for each goal, and that's what aid organizations and governments use to measure progress in Afghanistan. To be sure, there's still a lot of work to be done, but there are really good signs that the country is moving in the right direction. For example, in 2001, just after the Taliban lost power, there were only about 700,000 children in school, and almost none of them were girls. In the last assessment by the Afghanistan Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, I know it's a mouthful, but it's how they measure each of these goals and the progress. They go every year and they measure the progress the country has made in terms of achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Today, there are more than 9 million, closer to 10 million children in school, and 40% of those are girls. They are on track, not maybe for universal primary education by 2015, but 82%, which is pretty good if you ask anyone. Progress might be slow, but it's still progress. And a really good example is the maternal mortality rate. The Taliban in 1995 had brought the mortality rate to the highest in the world. There were 1,300 deaths for every 100,000 live births in 1995, meaning that a woman had a 1 in 9 chance of dying in childbirth. That's serious. That's huge. But by 2010, which is the last time the cluster survey measured this, it had dropped to 460, which is a 1 in 32 chance. That's a big improvement. It's still not great, considering that in Canada, I think it was a 1 in 200 chance of dying. A friend of mine at UNICEF was helping to actually compile these statistics. And you know what she told me the greatest factor was in predicting the results? It was the mother's education level. It all goes back to education, right? So the more educated a mother is, the more likely she is to give birth in a hospital or with a midwife or skilled attendant around. And therefore, she's more likely to survive childbirth. She's also more likely to register those births, to marry later, and she's more likely to be giving birth later. Her children are more likely to go to school, to be vaccinated, to be well-nourished, to survive infancy and then childhood. Her children are less likely to be involved in child labor and be abused. The family's access to things like water and adequate sanitation facilities is better, and they are generally wealthier. Educated mothers are healthier, they live longer, and so do their children. Sure, there are lots of challenges, and many of those Millennium Goals will go unmet, such as enhancing security, for example. And the poverty level is still one of the worst in the world, and it's not helped by the number of internally displaced persons in that country, the refugees that was found. But for a country that was at the bottom of the world rankings in almost every single one of those indicators, it has made really good progress, despite all the challenges. And at no time was that more obvious than on April 5th and this last Saturday. 7 million people defied Taliban threats to go out and cast their ballot. That's a turnout of 60%, which is double that of the last election in 2009. And a little higher than the 57% in this country in 2012. Most critically, 38% of those voters were women, lined up in burqas from Kandahar to Helmand to Herat to Bamiyan to enter the polling stations. And across the country, they held up a proud purple finger to show they had voted. Some of these women voted with their middle finger and happily held it up for the cameras. It was their message to the Taliban, saying, "You lost." Quick another indicator, who best to ask how Afghanistan's doing or how they think the country's doing than by asking Afghans. The Asia Society does an annual survey of the Afghan people. And last year it showed that 57% of Afghans say they believe the country is moving in the right direction. And again, I had this slide. Anyway, 57 say their country is moving in the right direction. I don't know what the number would be here, but I think I saw a poll this morning on NBC.
30%.
The reasons they give are reconstruction, improved security, improved access to education, and they like the idea that girls are going to school. So when you ask Afghans what the biggest challenges are, they consistently identify education and illiteracy, as well as a lack of job opportunities. Afghans themselves know that educating women and putting them in the workforce is essential to the economic development. Still, there will be some of those who say we can't change a culture. But they forget that repression of women hasn't historically been in Afghanistan's culture. In the 1920s, King Amanullah Khan and Queen Soraya started a process of modernizing Afghanistan. They had dreams of bringing Afghanistan into the Western world almost. You know, they unveiled women. They encouraged them to wear Western dress. They opened co-ed schools, encouraging girls and boys to go to school and learn together. Of course, he was overthrown, but those reforms continued. Muhammad Daoud Khan in the 60s and 70s encouraged women to go to university, and the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan made a number of reforms in the 70s, including giving women rights to equal education, job security, and health services. They banned forced marriages and gave women the right to vote. Now, granted, they also did this when they were torturing traditional elites, but, you know, it was still progress. It wasn't until the Taliban came to power in the 90s that strict Islamic law was enforced and women started to enforce it. But thanks largely to the involvement of the international community that's been there over the last 12 years, we have helped to reverse some of those losses and educate a generation of women. And Afghanistan will come close to meeting that goal of universal education. We have a short memory, especially as in the media, and it's so easy to point out all of that. I'm guilty of it. I am. That we forget the bigger picture, though, when we do that. Development is a long-term commitment. It's a long process. You can't just say, after 12 years, it's not happening fast enough for us, and we should leave. Some people will argue that we have sacrificed enough. This is part of the editorials and analysts' analyses that I was talking about earlier that really bothered me. They say we've sacrificed the lives of 2,185 U.S. soldiers, the wounds of close to another 20,000, and not to mention the contractors and aid workers who also never did it, and the billions in aid money that all of the NATO countries have put in. But I never met a soldier. I spent a lot of time whether Canadian or American or Dutch or British, who didn't believe in what we were trying to do there, to bring stability and security so that institutions like schools, universities, and courts could flourish and grow. For them and the families of those who have fallen, and for me, Afghanistan will always be personal, because we've all left a piece of ourselves, whether in the Afghan desert, the mountains, or in my case, in a hole in Wardak province. It means we all feel we have a stake in its future. I want to close by telling you a story about a good friend of mine. Captain Trevor Green was an officer in a reserve unit called the Seaforth Highlanders in the Canadian military. He was deployed to Kandahar in 2006 as a CIMIC officer. CIMIC stands for Civilian Military Cooperation. And their job was to visit villages. These aren't great, I'm sorry. Villages and talk to elders about access to clean water and other basic needs. He was attending a shura, which is a meeting of elders near Kandahar, and he took off his helmet, which is, you see him there without a helmet, which is a symbolic gesture of respect for the elders. That was when a 16-year-old boy split his head open. He was airlifted to Landstuhl, before being flown back to Canada. At which point, doctors told his fiancée Debbie that she should put him in a home because he would never learn. Doctors didn't know Trevor. He underwent years of rehabilitation, and he had to learn to do everything all over again. He still can't walk. He can stand, talk, we Skype all the time. And he's been writing a lot. He wrote a book about his experience. He wrote a second book on climate change since then. Started a foundation to fund teacher training in Afghanistan. And we started a scholarship together using sort of the royalties from both our books to offer a scholarship for women who wanted to go into teaching. We talk all the time, and I said I was doing this today, and he said, tell them we can't forget the good things that we managed to get done there. This is the same man whose life was nearly destroyed there, and I would say if he won't give up on Afghanistan, I don't know how anybody else. So it's not naive to remember that this is a process, and once in a while it's good to remember the things that are going right, which is very unusual for a journalist to want to do. But I think for me it was part of the bigger picture. The good stories, the successes, as small as they might be. It's my hope that this last trip back to Afghanistan is the first of many return trips, and that I will see sustained progress through the coming years. That perhaps this little girl that I met in Kandahar will be one of those successful. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mellissa. A lot to think about. Given us a lot to think about the U.S. and Canadian engagement in Afghanistan. I'm sure there must be some questions. Let me ask, on your last trip to Afghanistan, you emphasized the positive sides of progress. You see any sort of danger signs anymore, and so it could easily regress and slip back into what it was.
Well, that day, the day that we were heading into to visit the school, the orphanage, we were delayed, right? Because we didn't know why, but we were told not to leave. And then we discovered that it was because it was a big suicide bombing. Same road that we drove past around the same time the day before. And that just kind of makes you think, wow, right? Like it's, but for the grace of God, we're visiting the school that day. So it's always present. There's always, you can't go to Afghanistan without it being conscious of the fact that something might happen. Me especially, because of my experience. But I actually think that it was better than it was 5 years ago. I felt, now granted, this is skewed, because I had all these security guys around me, so they weren't going to let anything happen to me. But even they said, it's not so bad. This year was worse. I was there last May, so leading up to the elections, people were saying it's never been this bad. But the Taliban weren't able to stop the election. So I don't know. It's the best hope that I have for that country is the fact that either Dr. Abdullah or Ashraf Ghani, whoever wins, seem like they would lead the country better than Mr. Karzai. They both seem open to negotiating the VSA with the state. They say they will sign it. There will be a force left there. So, you know, I have hope. I try to see it now.
Is 10 years or 12 years of girls' education, is that enough to set a country on an irreversible course, or is that, do you see that as something very fragile?
I hope so. I mean, you didn't see in the story, but I talked to Nancy Dupree, who is known as the Grandmother of Afghanistan, and she's been there for 50 years. You know, she's lived there. She's originally from here. And yes, she said, you can't get a girl to unlearn her name. We have now got these women, these girls out there. And even if the Taliban tried to come back, she said, I don't think that it will be allowed to happen. I just don't. She says, there's a feeling among young people in that country now that, you know, it's their destiny. And they actually want, they want to build their country up. So, you know, if Nancy thinks that this can happen, who am I to say it won't?
John?
Thank you, Mellissa. This is wonderful, inspiring presentation. But I'm feeling a little bit like a cynical journalist, and I shouldn't. I don't want to feel that way. But in terms of the elections and the reports of massive corruption and fraud in the elections happening right now, when I look at the young Canadian teacher at the school who was talking about, we made a promise and it's all up to us. And I can understand the logic of that, but there's also the issue of what the Afghans are doing themselves and what responsibility they take for what happens in the country. And there has been enormous waste of resources and manipulation of foreign aid that came in. A lot of it our fault, but also on the Afghan side, the people were, whether they were actual overt warlords or just people on the take, wasting good resources. And so I look at the schools and the progress that the girls have made, and I'm hopeful, but I'm skeptical that it could continue.
I understand that skepticism because, you know, you hear about the bags of cash being delivered to palace, and corruption is a huge part of society. It just, there's no, you know, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a huge problem. I can only hope now. You know, Dr. Abdullah is saying hold the count because he believes there was widespread fraud in this last runoff election. So, you know, I don't know what's going to. He's kind of thrown it into some uncertainty right now. But I still, the fact that many Afghans came out and voted and risked their lives to do it in many cases. One guy I saw who had his finger chopped off by the Taliban first time he voted and still came back to vote. You know, so, you know, as pessimistic as we can be, there are these pockets of Afghans who really believe that they hold their destiny in their own hands, and they want to make a difference. You know, they're not saying, you know, they don't need our help, right? They feel like they still need us to a certain point. They're not quite ready to take over yet, according to, you know, many people I've talked to. So I don't know. I think we'll have to, as a journalist, we hate saying wait and see what happens, but in this case, I really want to wait and see who becomes the next president and what he does. And I think that'll tell us a lot about what direction.
That's going to be a much larger problem, a much longer one, because it is so culturally ingrained for his education and his desire. And so if we start there, and it keeps growing, we can eventually overcome. It's going to take a long time because it's so ingrained. It's just an everyday expectation. So to give up on that because of corruption, that'd be wrong.
Question in the back.
I think you've already created the seed. Westerners. And I was there 2 years ago, and I met a lot of females, a lot of girls willing to learn. They have that fire, they have that passion. They want to do something. You know, not only females, you also have other ex-Taliban members too, who've been going to reintegration programs, and also there've been a lot of scandal in that too. But if you still brew that fire, and you're still putting it more and more in that fire, eventually they're gonna try to lead on their own. They want to lead on their own. They just want a little bit of navigation. So yeah, you can be a little skeptical with the corruption and everything else, but there is still the brewing fire of willing to fight for something they want to do. And right now it starts with little girls, and if they're planting the seeds with their brothers, turn them to change males. Some of the males, a different perspective on how to treat women, how to see women
That's
as
happening.
the equal.
That survey of the Afghan people, the men were saying that women's education was an important factor in their country's future, right? The men recognize this. So I think the attitudes are changing. I mean, maybe not as fast as we would like them to because of everything we've been through there, but it's slowly happening.
Sort of listening to your story, it's like you take 5 steps forward, 4 steps back, 5 steps.
Yes, exactly. 3, 2, yeah. I don't think they can take 5 at a time.
Sort of related to slow progress, I'm curious if you had any opportunity to speak to anyone in the formal education system, besides as women working with informal, like education in orphanages or local schools. Any opportunity to talk to people about planning for the future of a state-level education, because it's a powerful influence on national memory.
I went to University of Kabul University, which is where Nancy Dupree has her new center for Afghan studies. And so I managed to talk to the head of the university, knew that I would be there, and had a conversation with him sort of off the record about post-secondary education, and he agreed that there is a need there because all of these 10 million kids are going to come out of school, and a lot of them want to continue on, and so I think that's part of government has a plan to build more universities. There's now a university in, I've got the numbers somewhere, but the number of universities has increased in the last 12 years. There's one in Kandahar. There is one up north. Kabul is not the only place where kids go to university anymore, but clearly more work still needs to be done in terms of building capacity for all this. And teacher training is an issue, right? Because where are you going to find university professors who are qualified enough to ensure that these kids, when they graduate, get a good post-secondary education? So, progress is still slow, but it's happening. They are planning for it.
I was trying to look this up before asking, just because I didn't want to ask a question that is like Googleable. But is there any indication about Taliban recruitment and whether it's up or down, or what it's like in comparison with a decade ago, 5 years ago, and are there still finding sympathetic ears in Afghanistan?
I think there are, and I've only talked to people who, in law enforcement. I think they are still trying to recruit, but what I'm told again and again is that Afghans are tired of war. They are really tired of fighting, and so I don't know how that has affected the recruitment drive, or how if they're having trouble recruiting because of that. But those are the two. I think in the south, places like Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan, there are still active movement. But I don't know how successful it is because there's a sense that people are tired.
Oh, thanks.
Sorry if you already covered this. I could have walked and gotten here to Bethel and I didn't. But I understood that the Taliban, part of the reason when they were able to take over is because people were already sick of 15, 20 years of fighting at that point. They wanted some order at any cost. And but how far, my father was an AID and a lot of his colleagues, grew up with a lot of his AID colleagues. I understood in the 60s and 70s they were really making a lot of progress in Afghanistan, all of which has been just demolished and destroyed by 30 years of fighting like that. How far did education, I know there was a lot of progress at different times, people walking down the streets of Western clothing, women were walking down the streets of Western clothing in the 60s and 70s, but how far did education get before it was knocked back to where the Taliban knocked it back to?
Well, women were in school, and women were in universities, and and if we just look at that, it's Fauzia Houthi, who I was talking about, had to leave school because the Taliban suddenly, she was in university, Taliban came in, she had to flee to Pakistan and sort of wait it out. And so, by the time she was able to come back and go to school again, she was years behind. And so I think, a couple things. Getting the women who weren't able to go to school and attend university back into schools took a while after the Taliban fell. And then sort of making sure that the women coming after them also had the same opportunities. I think it probably took us until now to get back to where we were. I'm just a guess, given the number of schools, teachers, universities that I see, and people that I have talked to. And now it's about building on that.
We see fairly clearly what's going on in Iraq now that the U.S. did that a couple of years or so. So the natural question is, what would you expect to happen to Afghanistan if the U.S. should achieve the best?
A couple of things that separate Iraq from Afghanistan, make it different. It's that largely, first of all, there was no set of forces agreement in Iraq. The U.S. just left. I'm pretty sure there will be one in Afghanistan because both presidential candidates said they will sign it. And so there will be a residual force left, which will hopefully keep some order in the country. Secondly, I think the violence you see in Iraq is sectarian mostly. And in Afghanistan, it's not so divided along those lines. Afghanistan was built from a bunch of different ethnicities to begin with, right? Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazara, and they're used to living together. They were living together, 100 years ago. So that sectarian divide isn't as strong. And Afghanistan is maybe divided along ethnic lines more than sectarian. And so we haven't seen in fighting with the Taliban that they've targeted Tajiks or Hazaras in particular. There have been isolated instances of some, Hazaras. I think there was one at Kabul University a couple of years ago. Five Hazaras killed, but that's unusual, right? The Taliban kill indiscriminately. They're not targeting a certain population. So, I'm hoping that it doesn't disintegrate because so far it's hasn't fallen along the same sectarian lines that Iraq has. And I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing what's happening.
We have time for a last question. And if we don't have one, we can adjourn to the other room where we still have some refreshments. Thank you so much, Melissa.